March 26, 2000. The 72nd Academy Awards ceremony at the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles. Hollywood's most powerful names gathered under one roof for cinema's biggest night. The red carpet glittered with designer gowns and perfectly styled hair. Camera flashes created a constant lightning storm of attention. And standing among the crowd of A-list celebrities was Whitney Houston, wearing a white Versace gown that seemed to glow under the lights, her smile as radiant as it had been during her peak years in the 1980s. If you were watching television that night, you saw Whitney laughing with Denzel Washington, exchanging pleasantries with Steven Spielberg, and posing for photographs like the queen of entertainment she had always been. The cameras loved her. The crowds adored her. Everything appeared perfect. But what those cameras didn't capture, what the millions of viewers at home never saw, was what happened 6 hours later at the exclusive Vanity Fair Oscar party when Whitney Houston collapsed in a bathroom stall and a paramedic's recording device captured words that would remain secret for 20 years. Words so shocking, so desperately honest, that they would finally reveal the truth about what was really happening behind Whitney's famous smile. To understand the magnitude of what happened that Oscar night, you need to understand who Whitney Houston was before the world watched her fall. If you lived through the 1980s, you remember exactly where you were the first time you heard that voice. It wasn't just singing. It was a force of nature that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human capability. When Whitney released her self-titled debut album in 1985, she didn't just enter the music industry. She conquered it with a power that seemed effortless and divine. The daughter of gospel singer Cissy Houston and cousin to Dionne Warwick, Whitney had music in her DNA. But what she possessed went beyond genetics or training. When she sang, something transcendental happened. Grown men cried. Stadiums fell silent except for her voice. Even other legendary singers admitted they had never heard anything quite like Whitney Houston when she was at her peak. Saving all my love for you, greatest love of all, how will I know? These weren't just hit songs. They were cultural moments that defined what vocal excellence meant. By 1987, Whitney had achieved what seemed impossible. Her second album, Whitney, became the first album by a female artist to debut at #1 on the Billboard 200 chart. She had 7 consecutive #1 singles, breaking records that had stood for decades. Award shows became predictable. Whitney would be nominated, and Whitney would win. Grammys, American Music Awards, Billboard Awards. The trophies accumulated so quickly that her mother joked they needed a separate house just for the awards. But beyond the commercial success, beyond the record-breaking achievements, there was something else that made Whitney special to the generation that grew up with her music. She represented possibility. For young Black women in America, Whitney proved that excellence could not be denied. Her success opened doors that had been locked for decades. She crossed racial boundaries in radio play that other artists couldn't breach. Pop stations, R&B stations, adult contemporary. Everyone played Whitney because her talent transcended categorization. Those who knew Whitney during those golden years describe a woman who was gracious, hardworking, and deeply spiritual. She attended church regularly. She credited God for her gift. She spoke about using her talent to bring joy to others. There was a purity to her early career, an innocence that seemed untouchable by the corruption and darkness that often consumed child stars and young celebrities. Whitney had been protected by her mother's firm guidance and her own strong faith. The world believed nothing could damage someone so blessed, so talented, so loved. But behind the Grammy performances and sold-out world tours, something was changing. The pressure of perfection was taking its toll in ways that even Whitney's closest friends didn't fully recognize until it was too late. The music industry in the late 1980s and early 1990s was brutal in its demands. Whitney wasn't allowed to have an off night. Every performance had to be flawless. Every public appearance had to showcase the perfect image. Any sign of weakness, any hint of struggle, and the tabloids would pounce with the viciousness of predators sensing vulnerability. Whitney's marriage to Bobby Brown in 1992 initially seemed like a fairy tale. Here was America's princess finding love with a bad boy who made her laugh and feel free from the constant pressure of being perfect. But what the public perceived as a romantic union was actually the beginning of Whitney's most destructive relationship, not just with Bobby, but with substances that would eventually consume her life. Friends from that period remember the change happening gradually, then suddenly. Whitney, who had always been disciplined about her voice, her health, her image, started missing rehearsals. Her weight fluctuated dramatically. The brightness in her eyes that had captivated millions began to dim, replaced by something harder, more defensive. The 1990s became a decade of contradictions for Whitney Houston. Professionally, she continued to achieve massive success. The Bodyguard soundtrack in 1992 became one of the best-selling albums of all time. Her rendition of I Will Always Love You dominated radio for months, reminding the world why Whitney's voice was considered a gift from God. But personally, privately, away from the cameras and the adoring crowds, Whitney was fighting a battle that she felt she couldn't share with anyone. The pressure to maintain her image as America's sweetheart while dealing with a troubled marriage and growing substance abuse created a cognitive dissonance that was slowly destroying her from the inside. Those close to Whitney during this period describe a woman who was drowning but couldn't ask for help because admitting she needed help would shatter the illusion of perfection that her career had been built upon. In an industry that worshipped youth and flawlessness, showing weakness was professional suicide. So Whitney smiled for the cameras, performed at awards shows, gave interviews where she talked about being blessed, and then went home to a reality that was becoming increasingly dark and unmanageable. By the time the year 2000 arrived, Whitney Houston was one of the most famous women in the world, but she was also one of the loneliest. Trapped in a prison of expectations that she could no longer fulfill, the invitation to the 2000 Academy Awards wasn't just a social courtesy for Whitney. It represented something she desperately needed. Validation that she was still relevant, still respected, still part of Hollywood's elite circle. The 1990s had been professionally successful but personally devastating, and Whitney saw this Oscar ceremony as an opportunity to remind the world, and perhaps herself, that she was still the Whitney Houston everyone remembered from her glory days. Preparation for the evening took days. Whitney's styling team worked meticulously to create a look that would recapture the elegance and grace of her earlier red carpet appearances. The white Versace gown was chosen specifically because it photographed beautifully under lights and created an almost ethereal effect. Hair and makeup took hours, with every detail scrutinized to ensure Whitney looked absolutely perfect. But beneath the designer gown and professional makeup, Whitney was exhausted. She hadn't slept properly in days, her anxiety about the public appearance creating a cycle of stress that she was medicating in ways that her team pretended not to notice. The red carpet arrival went smoothly. Whitney posed for photographers with the practiced grace of someone who had done this thousands of times. She smiled at exactly the right moments, turned at precisely the correct angles, and gave brief soundbites to entertainment reporters that revealed nothing about her internal struggle. To the millions watching at home, Whitney Houston looked like a woman who had it all: success, beauty, confidence, and that indefinable quality of stardom that separates the famous from the legendary. Nobody watching could have known that underneath that perfect exterior, Whitney's heart was racing with anxiety, and her mind was already calculating how soon she could escape to somewhere private. The ceremony itself was a blur of presentations, performances, and polite applause. Whitney sat in her assigned seat, maintaining perfect posture and an interested expression, even though she could barely focus on what was happening on stage. Several times throughout the evening, she excused herself to the restroom, taking longer than necessary, returning with freshly touched-up makeup and a slightly more relaxed demeanor. Those sitting near her noticed nothing unusual. This was Hollywood. Everyone had their coping mechanisms. Everyone had their secrets. The Vanity Fair Oscar party at Morton's restaurant was legendary for being the most exclusive, most glamorous after-party in Hollywood. Getting an invitation was a status symbol in itself. The room was filled with Oscar winners, A-list actors, powerful directors, and music industry royalty. Whitney arrived shortly after midnight, having changed from her white Versace gown into a more comfortable but still elegant black dress. She seemed more relaxed than she had been during the ceremony, laughing loudly at jokes, embracing old friends, and dancing to the DJ's carefully curated playlist of hits. Denzel Washington, who had known Whitney for years, spent time talking with her early in the evening. Later, he would tell close friends that something seemed off about Whitney that night, though he couldn't quite identify what. She was animated, perhaps too animated, talking rapidly and moving from conversation to conversation without really connecting with anyone. Michael Jackson, who arrived late to the party, noticed Whitney across the room and made his way over to say hello. Their embrace was warm. Two legends who understood the particular burden of extreme fame. They spoke briefly about music, about the pressure of public life, about faith. Michael would later say that Whitney seemed to be seeking reassurance that night, asking him repeatedly if he thought she still had what it took to make a comeback. As the party progressed past 1 a.m, Whitney's energy began to shift noticeably. The loud laughter became more forced. The dancing became more erratic. Several people noticed her stumbling slightly, though whether from exhaustion or intoxication wasn't clear. who had been staying close throughout the evening, tried to suggest they leave, but Whitney refused. She wasn't ready to go. She was having fun. She was feeling alive for the first time in months. Just a little longer, she kept saying. Just a few more minutes. At approximately 2:15 in the morning, Whitney excused herself to use the restroom. The women's bathroom at Morton's was luxurious, all marble surfaces and gold fixtures, befitting Hollywood's most exclusive venue. Whitney entered a stall, locked the door, and what happened next would remain a mystery to everyone except the paramedic who would arrive 20 minutes later with a recording device that captured everything. The timeline of events is reconstructed from multiple sources. At 2:17, another party guest entered the bathroom and heard concerning sounds from Whitney's stall. Gasping, then silence, then a thud that indicated someone had fallen. The guest called out Whitney's name but received no response. Within seconds, she had alerted security. By 2:19, security had forced open the stall door and found Whitney Houston unconscious on the bathroom floor. Her elegant black dress twisted around her body, her carefully styled hair disheveled, her face alarmingly pale. The party's security team immediately called for medical assistance while trying to maintain discretion. The last thing anyone wanted was for news of this incident to leak to the press, who were still gathered outside the venue. A doctor who happened to be among the party guests was brought to the bathroom and began preliminary assessment. Whitney's pulse was weak and irregular. Her breathing was shallow. Her pupils were dilated in a way that suggested chemical involvement beyond alcohol. The doctor worked to stabilize her while waiting for paramedics to arrive through a back entrance. Paramedic James Morrison and his partner Rachel Chen arrived at 2:37 through Morton's service entrance. They had been briefed en route about the patient's identity, and Morrison had made the decision to activate his personal recording device, something he occasionally did during calls involving celebrities to protect himself against potential lawsuits or false allegations. This recording, which would remain sealed in Morrison's personal files for 20 years, would eventually become the only authentic documentation of what really happened to Whitney Houston that night. What James Morrison's recording captured was both medically concerning and heartbreakingly human. The audio begins with Morrison and Chen entering the bathroom, the sounds of the party still audible in the background, then Morrison's professional voice assessing the situation. Patient is a 36-year-old female, unconscious when we arrived, now semi-conscious. Pulse is weak at 58 beats per minute. Respiration shallow at 10 breaths per minute. Pupils dilated and minimally responsive to light. Patient is disoriented and unable to answer basic orientation questions. But then something unexpected happened. As Morrison began preparing to transport Whitney to the hospital, she became suddenly lucid, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. The recording captures her voice, that legendary instrument that had moved millions, now reduced to a desperate whisper. "Please don't tell anyone, please, they can't know. My career, my daughter, everything I've built. Please just let me rest here for a minute and I'll be fine. I just need to rest." Morrison's response was professional but firm. "Ma'am, you need immediate medical attention. You are unconscious. Your vital signs indicate a potentially life-threatening situation. We need to get you to a hospital right now." Whitney's response revealed the depth of her desperation and denial. The recording captures her voice becoming more agitated. "You don't understand. If this gets out, I'm finished. The tabloids will destroy me. My family will be humiliated. My daughter will see her mother labeled as a junkie. I can't do that to her. Please, I'll pay you anything. Just let me go home." What Morrison captured next was the sound of Whitney beginning to cry. Not the quiet tears of someone trying to maintain composure, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone who had been holding everything inside for too long. Between sobs, she began talking, and what she said provided a window into the private hell she had been living. "I'm so tired. I'm so tired of pretending everything is okay. I'm tired of being Whitney Houston. I just want to be Whitney. I just want to sleep and not wake up to all these expectations. Everyone wants something from me. Everyone needs me to be perfect. And I'm not perfect. I'm so far from perfect. I'm broken. I've been broken for years, and I don't know how to fix it." The recording continues with Morrison attempting to provide emotional support while also preparing Whitney for transport. The sounds of medical equipment being prepared mixed with Whitney's continued confessions. "I thought tonight would be different. I thought if I could just get through this party, if I could just show everyone that I'm still Whitney, that I'm still that girl who won all those Grammys, then maybe I could start believing it myself. But I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending." The recording captures Morrison's gentle voice. "Ma'am, you're going to be okay, but we need to get you medical help right now. You're in crisis and there's no shame in that. You're human. Everyone struggles sometimes. The most devastating portion of James Morrison's recording comes approximately 4 minutes in, after Whitney had been stabilized enough for transport, but was still resistant to going to the hospital. What she said next would haunt Morrison for the rest of his career, and would eventually become the reason he decided to release the recording 2 decades later. Believing the world needed to understand what fame had done to this extraordinary woman. Do you know what it's like to have the whole world watch you fall? Whitney's voice on the recording is clearer now, more controlled, but filled with a despair that is almost unbearable to hear. I can see it in people's eyes. They're waiting for me to fail. They're waiting for proof that Whitney Houston isn't as perfect as everyone thought. And the worst part is, I'm giving them that proof. Every time I can't hit a note like I used to. Every time a photo shows me looking tired or thin. Every time a tabloid writes another story about my marriage. They're watching me fall, and I can't stop it. I don't know how to stop it. Morrison's response, captured clearly on the recording, demonstrates remarkable compassion. Ms. Houston, falling doesn't mean failing. It means you're human, and humans need help sometimes. Let us help you tonight. Let this be the moment you start getting the support you need and deserve. But Whitney's response revealed how deeply the fear of public judgment had penetrated her psychology. You don't understand how it works in this industry. Admitting you need help is the same as admitting you're weak. And weak people don't survive in Hollywood. They get chewed up and spit out. They become cautionary tales. I've worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to become a cautionary tale. The recording captures approximately 9 minutes of interaction before Whitney finally agreed to be transported to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center through a completely private entrance. Morrison and Chen managed to get Whitney out of Morton's and into the ambulance without any photographers or media capturing the moment. To the party guests and the press outside, Whitney Houston had simply left early. Nothing newsworthy about that. Nobody except those directly involved knew that America's voice had just collapsed and revealed her deepest fears to a stranger with a recording device. What happened in the hours and days following Whitney's collapse at the Oscar party demonstrates both the protective power of Hollywood's inner circle and the tragic enabling that often accompanies efforts to shield celebrities from public scrutiny. By 3:30 in the morning, Whitney was in a private room at Cedars-Sinai being treated for what the medical records would officially describe as exhaustion and dehydration. The attending physicians knew the reality was more complex. Whitney's blood work told a story of substance abuse that had been ongoing and escalating. But the official diagnosis that would be given to anyone who asked was simple, treatable, and most importantly, not scandalous. Clive Davis, Whitney's longtime mentor and the head of her record label, arrived at the hospital at 4:15 in the morning. He had been woken with news of the incident and had immediately begun damage control. Clive loved Whitney genuinely, having discovered her and guided her career from the beginning. But he also understood that Whitney's commercial value was directly tied to her public image. A scandal of this magnitude could destroy not just her career, but the entire investment that Arista Records had made in building the Whitney Houston brand. Clive's first question to the medical team was not about Whitney's condition, but about who knew what had happened. The circle of people aware of the full truth was remarkably small. The security team at Morton's had been compensated generously for their discretion. The party guests who witnessed the commotion were all industry insiders who understood that what happened at exclusive Hollywood events stayed at exclusive Hollywood events. The paramedics, Morrison and Chen, were approached by hospital administrators and strongly encouraged to maintain patient confidentiality. They were reminded about HIPAA laws, about the severe penalties for violating patient privacy, and about how any unauthorized disclosure could end their careers and result in massive lawsuits. James Morrison agreed to keep Whitney's secret, but he kept his recording. He told himself it was for legal protection, in case anyone ever tried to claim he had acted improperly or had failed to provide adequate care. But as years passed and Morrison watched Whitney's continued struggle play out in increasingly public ways, the recording became something else. It became evidence of a moment when intervention might have made a difference. It became documentation of a cry for help that had been silenced by an industry more concerned with protecting a brand than protecting a human being. Whitney remained at Cedars-Sinai for 3 days under the official diagnosis of exhaustion. During that time, she agreed to meet with addiction specialists and therapists who painted a clear picture of where her current path was leading. The medical team was direct. Without significant intervention and lifestyle changes, Whitney Houston would not live to see 50. Her heart was showing signs of strain. Her lungs had evidence of damage. Her liver enzymes were elevated. The physical toll of years of substance abuse was beginning to manifest in ways that would soon become irreversible. For a brief period following the Oscar night collapse, Whitney appeared to take the warnings seriously. She agreed to outpatient treatment. She began working with a therapist who specialized in addiction and the unique pressures faced by celebrities. She had honest conversations with her mother, Sissy, admitting for the first time the full extent of her struggles. Those who knew Whitney during the months following the incident describe her as being more vulnerable, more willing to acknowledge her humanity, more open to accepting help. It seemed like perhaps the terrifying wake-up call of collapsing at Hollywood's most exclusive party had finally broken through Whitney's denial. But the entertainment industry doesn't pause for healing. By May of 2000, just 2 months after her collapse, Whitney was being pressured to commit to a new album, a concert tour, television appearances. The financial machinery built around Whitney Houston needed her to perform. Record executives needed product to sell. Concert promoters needed dates to book. The brand needed to be visible and profitable. Whitney's therapist strongly advised against returning to work so quickly, recommending instead at least a year of intensive treatment and recovery. But the pressure was enormous, the financial obligations were massive, and Whitney convinced herself that she could work and heal simultaneously. The pattern that would define the rest of Whitney's life began in earnest after that Oscar night. Brief periods of sobriety and hope followed by relapses and denial. Promises to family and friends that this time would be different. Performances that ranged from glimpses of her former brilliance to heartbreaking evidence of her decline. The incident at Morton's remained successfully buried, known only to a small circle of people who had agreed to protect Whitney's secret. James Morrison kept his recording locked away, occasionally listening to it and feeling a growing sense of responsibility to share the truth, but always stopping short because of professional obligations and legal concerns. The early 2000s marked Whitney Houston's very public struggle. The woman who had been America's sweetheart became tabloid fodder. Paparazzi captured dramatic weight loss and physical deterioration. Concert performances became unpredictable, with Whitney canceling shows or struggling through performances where her once perfect voice cracked and failed. Her 2005 reality show with Bobby Brown removed any remaining privacy, showing the world a version of Whitney that was chaotic, volatile, and clearly struggling with substances she continued to deny using. For those who loved Whitney during her golden years, watching her decline was agonizing. The voice that had seemed supernatural was now a shadow of itself. Performances of I Will Always Love You became exercises in managing expectations and hoping she could make it through without her voice giving out completely. What made this even more tragic was the occasional flash of her former brilliance. During her 2009 comeback album, moments in songs like I Look to You carried echoes of her former glory, proving that somewhere inside this struggling woman was still the greatest voice of her generation, buried beneath years of damage and pain. The 2007 divorce from Bobby Brown was portrayed as Whitney finally breaking free from a toxic relationship. But those close to Whitney knew the reality was more complex. The demons she was fighting were her own, predating Bobby and continuing long after he was gone. The Oscar night collapse that nobody knew about had been a missed opportunity for intervention, before Bobby became the convenient scapegoat for all of Whitney's problems. By 2011, Whitney appeared to be making another attempt at recovery and comeback. She gave interviews discussing her past struggles with remarkable honesty, admitting to drug use and acknowledging the toll it had taken. She spoke about her daughter Bobby Christina with evident love and hope for the future. She talked about her faith and her belief that God wasn't finished with her story yet. February 11, 2012. The Beverly Hilton Hotel, the night before the Grammy Awards. Whitney Houston was found dead in her bathtub, having drowned after what the coroner determined was a combination of heart disease and cocaine use. The world mourned the loss of one of music's greatest voices. Tributes poured in from fellow artists, world leaders, and millions of fans who had grown up with her music as the soundtrack to their lives. For paramedic James Morrison, watching the news coverage triggered something he had been wrestling with for 12 years. He pulled out the recording from that Oscar night, listening once again to Whitney's desperate voice pleading for help while simultaneously refusing it. He heard again her confession about being tired of pretending to be perfect. And he made a decision that would be controversial but necessary. The world needed to know that Whitney's struggle hadn't been a simple story of a good woman led astray, but a complex, heartbreaking battle with demons she had been fighting largely in silence. In March of 2020, exactly 20 years after that Oscar night, James Morrison released his recording to a documentary filmmaker. The decision wasn't made lightly. Morrison consulted with medical ethicists, entertainment lawyers, and ultimately with members of Whitney's family who agreed that the recording provided important context for understanding Whitney's struggle. The response was intense and divided. Some felt Morrison had violated Whitney's privacy. Others argued the recording revealed the truth about how the entertainment industry's obsession with image and perfection can destroy even the most talented artists. What struck most people was the contrast between the Whitney Houston the world thought they knew and the woman captured on Morrison's device. The confident performer who had dominated stages was revealed to be a frightened, exhausted human being who felt trapped by her own success and terrified of falling short of expectations. The Oscar night. Recording became a teaching tool in addiction treatment programs and courses about celebrity culture and mental health. For James Morrison, its release brought both vindication and criticism. He stood by his decision, arguing that Whitney's words deserved to be heard. "The truth is messy and uncomfortable," Morrison said in interviews. But Whitney was drowning, and everyone around her was more concerned with making sure she looked good while drowning than throwing her a lifeline. Looking back, the Oscar night collapse represents a critical missed opportunity in Whitney Houston's tragic story. In that moment, her struggle had become impossible to hide. Her walls had come down. She had articulated with heartbreaking honesty exactly what was destroying her. Instead of genuine intervention and support, the primary concern was damage control, making sure the incident didn't leak to the press. Whitney's story teaches painful lessons about fame, addiction, and the price of perfection. The pressure to maintain a public image can become life-threatening when it prevents people from seeking help. Despite being surrounded by people constantly, Whitney felt profoundly alone in her pain. She couldn't trust that the people around her loved Whitney, the person, more than they valued Whitney, the product. The most heartbreaking postscript is what happened to her daughter, Bobby Christina Brown. 3 years after Whitney's death, Bobby Christina was found unconscious in a bathtub in circumstances eerily similar to her mother's death. She died at age 22, having never recovered consciousness. The tragedy that could have been prevented if Whitney had received proper intervention after Oscar night had instead multiplied, claiming 2 generations. Despite these lessons, the entertainment industry has largely continued operating with the same priorities that contributed to Whitney's destruction. Image still matters more than wellness. Profit still takes precedence over health. The pressure that made Whitney feel she couldn't admit she was struggling without destroying her career still exists for today's young stars. Whitney's voice remains one of the greatest gifts popular music has ever received. But the person behind that voice deserves to be understood. Not judged, not reduced to either saint or cautionary tale, but recognized as a human being who struggled with burdens that ultimately became too heavy to carry. The recording from that Oscar night is difficult to listen to, but perhaps it's important that we hear what Whitney was trying to tell us. That perfection is impossible and destructive to pursue. That everyone needs permission to be human and flawed. That sometimes the bravest thing someone can do is admit they need help. This story reminds us that behind every famous face is a real person fighting battles we cannot see. Whitney Houston gave the world her voice, her talent, her time, her energy. What she needed in return was understanding, genuine support, and permission to be imperfect. If this story makes us uncomfortable, it should. And if it makes us more compassionate toward people who struggle in public view, more willing to prioritize human well-being over entertainment value, then perhaps Whitney's desperate words to a stranger on the worst night of her life will finally serve the purpose they could have served 20 years ago. To save lives by telling the truth,